Welcome to the book spoiler portion of the podcast. This is going to hit the ground running, so if you haven't read the book Wool or the other two novels, Shift and Dust, in Hugh Howey's Silo series trilogy, please jump out. I really do not want anyone spoiled. I'm going to begin this part of the book spoiler podcast by just revealing a behind-the-scenes fact. I loved this little saying from the first book, Wool, and I put it in the show notes for the book spoiler section for the first episode. I've meant to say this on literally 8 previous book spoiler podcasts, but I always get distracted because I'm like, oh, I want to jump to this fun thing. I want to talk about this first thing. So I'm looking at the notes, and I wrote this, 9 weeks ago. I wrote, there's this saying in the first book, built from the ground down. That's like one of the things people in the silo say. So rather than saying our current modern saying of this was built from the ground up, the saying in the book is this was built from the ground down. I love that. It's perfect. And I've meant to refer to it all these weeks. Finally, I'm getting this note out of the way. Okay, so I tried to make a really good spoiler version for you guys this episode. And first off, how closely do you watch the podcast? I've had this image in every podcast on season 2. And do you notice when you look at the image what it really is? It shows Sims in the algorithm room. Now let me talk through this craziness again. So the show, there's the big circular door that's in the server room. You open the server door and you go into the thing called the algorithm room. That's with the white lights and kind of the step stairs up and down, which are drawers. Then you go into the legacy, which is the kind of more livable room. But this photo, which I've had since before the season began, shows Sims in the algorithm room. We learned in episode 9 that he wants to get Bernard's key. Well, doesn't this kind of prove that he gets it? He gets in the algorithm room. This is probably an image of him looking at the algorithm, and what's it going to tell him? Is this going to be R.I.P. Sims? Uh-oh. Not good. One thing that I have to talk about as spoiler is somebody wrote to me in a comment because I was talking about Wizard of Oz recently because they've had the book The Wizard of Oz, and somebody wrote in a comment said, no spoilers on The Wizard of Oz, we haven't read it yet. And boy, that is one you think, boy, has this person not read The Wizard of Oz? Also, comically, for Season 1, Episode 9, Spoiler Talk, I brought up The Wizard of Oz and how I thought the showrunners were adding these unnecessary complications, and I did a comical version if they had adapted The Wizard of Oz, how they would throw in stupid side plots like Doug Trumbull from Season 1 into The Wizard of Oz. I did it as a joke. And then this season, The Wizard of Oz becomes such a big part of it. And isn't this scene at the end of Episode 9, with Lukas going to the door in the tunnel at the bottom of the silo and hearing the voice of the algorithm, isn't the algorithm nothing but The Wizard of Oz? And in The Wizard of Oz, spoiler, so once again, somehow if you haven't seen or read The Wizard of Oz, take off now, or Wicked, or The Wiz, or all these adaptations, take off now, because this is going to be a spoiler. The Wizard of Oz is the man behind the curtain, and he's kind of a small man, a humbug. And isn't that really the people behind the silo? Aren't they really small men and humbugs and kind of buffoons for doing this? A bit like the Wizard of Oz is a buffoon. Is that a sign? If I've just spoiled the Wizard of Oz for you, I apologize. Last week, and I've done it a handful of times, but last week I really read from the book, the first book, Wool, and people tended to like it. I thought I'd talk about Juliette meeting the Silo 17 kids. I'd read that and then talk about how it's different. In the book, the children did attack Solo, but they did not take him hostage. Juliette is, instead of, in this case, they set up a trap to catch Juliette. In the book, Juliette is kind of tracking them and tracking their noise, and she's kind of tracked them to their hidden place on one of the floors in this silo. And so Juliette's sneaking up on them. She moved, and I'm going to read once again. This is page 485 from my version of Wool, my paperback version of Wool I bought many years ago. It looks like it's chapter 74. Juliette moved closer. She crouched down and put her ear to the door. Nothing. She reached up and tried the knob. Felt it was locked. How could it be locked unless... The door flew open, her hand still on the knob, yanking her into the darkness. There was a flash of light, then a man over her, swinging something at her head. Juliette fell onto her ass. A silver blur moved past her face, the crunch of a heavy wrench slamming into her shoulder, knocking her flat. There was a high-pitched scream from the back of the room, drowning out Juliette's cry of pain. She swung the knife in front of her, hit the man's leg. The wrench clattered to the ground. More screams, people shouting. Juliette kicked away from the door and stood, clutching her shoulder. She was ready for the man to pounce, but her attacker was backing away, limping on one foot. A boy, no more than 14, maybe 15. "Stay where you are!" Juliette aimed the knife at him. The boy's eyes were wide with fear. A group of kids huddled against the back wall on a scattering of mattresses and blankets. They clung to one another, their wide eyes aimed at Juliette. The confusion was overwhelming. She was seized by the sensation of wrongness. Where were the others, the adults? She could feel people with bad intentions sliding down the dark hallway behind her, ready to pounce. Here were their kids, locked away for safety. Soon the mother rats would be back to punish her for disturbing their nest. So as you can see, Juliette really did think she was attacking these evil, villains, these evil adults. And instead, she finds the kids. I'm going to jump down just a bit. "Where are the others?" Juliette asked, her hands trembling from the cold, the confusion, the fear. She scanned the room. A girl in her teens sat frozen on a tangle of blankets, 2 young boys and a young girl clinging to her. The eldest boy glanced down at his leg. A stain of blood was spreading across his green overalls. "How many are there?" She took a step closer. The kids were obviously more afraid of her than she was of them. "Leave us alone," the older girl screamed. She clutched something to her chest. The young girl beside her pressed her face into the older girl's lap, trying to disappear. The 2 young boys glared like cornered dogs, but did not move. "How did you get here?" she asked them. She aimed the knife at the tall boy, starting to feel silly for wielding it. He looked at her in confusion, not comprehending the question, and Juliette knew. Of course, how would there be decades of fighting in this silo without the second human passion? "You were born down here, weren't you?" Nobody answered. The boy's face screwed up in confusion as if the question were mad. She peeked back over her shoulder. "Where are your parents? When will they be back? How long?" "Never," the girl screeched, her head straining forward from the effort. "They're dead." Okay, so these are the kids. Now, there's a bit of difference in the book and the show. In the show, the oldest boy, the kind of boy who stands up for Juliette, his name is Rickson in the books, but just Rick in the show. And he's named after his father, Rick, a plumber. So there's Rickson. Now, on the show, the older girl's name is Audrey, but in the books, it's Hannah. And in the books, the baby they haven't given a name to. I actually love that. Now, the younger girl in the book is named Elise. So I suppose there's a chance that either her real name could be Elise on the show too, but in the book it's Elise. I don't think they ever call her Eater from what I remember. Another thing they did besides rename is if Eater is supposed to be Elise, they've aged her up. Elise is only 7 years old in the books, in Dust. Do you care about the names? Do you care about them aging up the kids? Certainly Rickson and Hannah look older than they were in the books, which was like 15 at the most, right? Do you guys care about that? Let me know. Another difference between the book and the show is that in the book, Juliette had access to the vault, the legacy, the algorithm room, whatever the show wants to call it. Juliette had access to it earlier. She finds the kids, she brings them to Solo, and they kind of live, at the end of this book, they're kind of living happily ever after. Juliette returns to Silo 18 by herself. As I pointed out on the main podcast, now she has 2 suits. Will she bring Eater with her? Would Solo come? That doesn't seem to make too much sense to me. What do you guys think? Can't wait to hear it. Are you excited for this final episode? Did you like the kid reveal? Again, in the main podcast, I said I wish it had come earlier. Maybe it's tough sometimes to show distance. Maybe they could have emphasized just how many floors away these kids were living from Solo to explain, why they almost didn't know about each other. But in the end, I like it. I like that it wasn't too different from the book. What did you guys think? Go down in the comments and let me know. Let me turn to your feedback. This is book spoiler feedback. Hadim gives us this first note, and Hadim writes, "The show is screwing up royally in many ways." Hadim, I really loved episode 9. As I mentioned in the main part of the podcast, my only problem with episode 9 is it makes me dislike some of the earlier episodes even more. Let me know what you think. Hopefully you turned around on the season a bit like I did, or at least on this episode. I want to hear it. Next, Zombie Italian also says the relationship between Solo and Juliette is definitely better in the book. I'm going to pause before I read any more of his feedback and say that I assume this is because the Juliette in the show, she is a different character almost. Her personality is in many ways different or harsher than the Juliette in the book. The Juliette in the book is more like in every person, in every woman. We always say this character is in every man. Well, Juliette is in every woman. And on the show, this is somebody who has worked in mechanical all these years, who has had the pain of losing her mother and brother as she did, and yet still holds those scars. The scar of George's death, as I mentioned throughout the season 1 book spoiler podcast, got moved up to be a recent wound rather than an old wound that's been healed over. So I think that continued into season 2, and maybe that's why I really got frustrated with Juliette and Solo's relationship in season 2. But at the end of episode 9, that hand on the shoulder, it worked for me. I wish it had come, even 2 episodes sooner. But, late is better than never. Now, Zombie-Talion continues. With that said, the show is still the best one out there right now, meaning the best TV show out there right now. And since things are different in the show, it keeps us book readers on our toes guessing what's going to happen. We, as book readers, I think should stop trying to compare and just enjoy it for what it is. Not perfect, but still good. That is the right attitude, and hopefully I'm saying that is the way I feel too. This show is not perfect in any stretch of the imagination, but it still has good elements, and hopefully we'll continue to celebrate those while also being honest about how the show can stub its own toe at times, certainly from a book reader's perspective. Many of these book podcasts we've talked about shift, and Bridget writes, some of the characters in the quote-quote past in Shift are also in the 3rd book in present day. So we have to meet some of them soon, right? Wonderful question, Bridget. I never like getting into specifics, and I'll say this probably multiple times, but why am I always so cagey about specifics in the book spoiler part of the podcast? It's because of my own behavior. I have watched a lot of videos. I've listened to a lot of podcasts about that say, we're going to go into spoilers. And I think to myself, I can just listen to a little bit and I won't get too spoiled. And every time I get spoiled on too much. So if you're listening now and haven't read these books, really jump away. But Bridget, you are exactly right. The characters who end up creating the silo through, sci-fi means are able to extend their lives, cryogenic sleep. They're able to still be around in the present timeline of the show. And you would assume, here's the real kick in the pants, Bridget, and we'll have our answer within a week in episode 10. Has the show, just like with Steve Zahn, they hired before season 1 had really premiered, but they had already shot it. They wanted Steve Zahn for season 2. They hired him pretty much right after they made season 1. So the question about some of those characters from Shift who kind of appear in the past and then live long enough to be in the present, you would assume the show wants those to be name actors, an actor you would have heard of like Steve Zahn. So the trick is, would they hire that person for just one episode, episode 10 of season 2, or would they not hire them until they really are going to use them a lot in season 3? If they haven't hired that big name actor to appear as a cameo, for lack of a better word, at the end of this season, have they? There haven't been any rumors out there, but you never know. So again, we'll have our answer in a week if we'll see some of those Shift characters this season. Bridget, I swear to God, I hope we see them next season. But this show, its relationship to the books is a bit like Zombie-Talion and others have said. It's going to keep us guessing, and I don't want to make a guess because I will always guess wrong because I trust the books. User with the handle unknown wrote, books versus adaptations. It's always a lesser version in the adaptation, and the events are either deleted or distorted in a way that makes it boring. I'm upset that the character paths of Mark, Shirley, McLean, and Lukas are different. Well, unknown, correct me if I'm wrong. Mark, there's no Mark in the show. And Mark, there's not even like somebody you could comparatively say, well, this is the equivalent of the character. I think they just flat out cut Mark. Shirley, taking away her being married and her relationship, maybe there's some benefits because you could see a relationship develop between her and Knox in this show version. But yeah, I don't know about if she's been an improvement. McLean, I guess, is an improvement in the show because, again, there's this other element of the relationship with Walker. And then Lukas, don't get me started. Oh no, the final note I have in my list is from Craig, who wrote, I find it very frustrating watching this series after reading the books. Craig, that's me. Somehow, we all have to try to turn off our brain about the books that we love that this show at times is very loosely based on. Okay, next week is episode 10. I really liked episode 9. I hope you guys did. I hope episode 10 can turn it around. It's entitled Into the Fire. Does that hint, like the soundtrack, hints that Juliette will make it back to Silo 18? We'll have to see. I'll talk to you guys next week.